As of January 2022, Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition has 39 civilizations. Now, while the debate rages on as to just how much variation actually exists between them, one important difference is that each civilization does have their own unique unit, or in the case of some, multiple unique units. Now, it is important to keep in mind that unique unit is not merely a synonym for mindlessly create this unit to the exclusion of others. In this video, we're going to be ranking the unique units in AOE2 DE and think about how they fit into a civilization's optimal strategy. For instance, can you make a particular unit the focal point of your army throughout the ages, or is its effectiveness more situational in nature? By gaining a deeper knowledge of the unique units in the game, you'll be able to integrate these ideas into your gameplay so that you can have fun, get out there on the ladder, and get after it. What is going on, everybody? It's your boy Jimmy James 59, and before we get into the tier list, I just want to say if you like the video, you like what we're doing on the channel, go ahead, give us that like and subscribe, and ring that Town Center YouTube notification bell so that way all those videos that get produced on this channel, when they come out, they'll make it back to your town center and you can chill out and watch them. Now, before we get into ranking the units, unique units are a bit more difficult to practically assess because there is not a sort of between ranking because they're unique to civilization. So, when we think about a sort of between context, we can compare, say, Sicilian Cavaliers with Slavic Cavaliers, for instance, but it's a lot more difficult to do that with unique units. So we have to have a more absolute kind of ranking system. And so I want to show you what I mean by the particular tiers that we're going to be looking at. S tier units are easily, and really should be in most cases, the focal point of your army. You really can't go wrong making these units. It plays to your civilization strengths. They're pretty difficult to counter unless somebody just has a massive advantage on you already. And even then, sometimes they can still bring games back from the brink. And not only that, but you can really start making them as soon as you get to Castle Age. We're going to see that some of the units on this list really aren't having much of an effect till way at the end of the game. And we have to downgrade those units because, again, they're not helping you for most of the game. On this channel, and the way I like to approach the game is think about how it plays in, in different ages. And so a unique unit that's helping you out a lot in Castle Age is much more valuable than a unit that, probably is only going to show up in late Imperial Age. Now, when we look at the A tier, these are still very strong units. They're probably worth building your army around. They're strong, and they're either very flexible or their mission is so specialized that they can win you games. But some of the drawbacks is that they typically do have some kind of effective counters, so they don't have that sort of OP flair or sensibility like we tend to see in the S tier. Not saying that all the units in S tier are overpowered and need to be redesigned or anything, but just when you're going up against them, you're thinking, gosh, what on earth do I do against this unit? I mean, those are the kind of questions that S tier units create. A tier units, you go, wow, it's a strong unit, but you still generally know what you need to do to stop it. Now, in the B tier, and this is to avoid this becoming kind of a gray zone for units that are kind of difficult to define, here units are usually a higher quality substitute for one of the typical mainline gold units you see. So units here will be able to, say, be a substitute for Cavaliers or be a substitute for crossbows, something like that. But they're designed oftentimes to win matchups against particular classes of units, and for those units that do that, they generally do struggle to fill the role of mainline units. So it's kind of an either or here. Either it's just really a more high quality substitute that's going to be more population efficient, or it has a more particular specialization that it wins pretty effectively. They're often still vulnerable to typical counters, and they can just be a little bit more difficult to get masked up. So those are the kind of things you want to keep in mind in the B tier. C tier, now we're starting to get to a point where you want to think twice about whether making the unit is necessary. Often it's not going to be a substitute for the gold unit in your army. Usually armies tend to have a composition of a gold unit, trash unit, and then siege unit. And these units are either so niche for particular matchups or just don't appear to have a clearly defined role that they can't serve that purpose in your army. They tend to be either awkward to mass, whether in their creation or if they create quickly. They're just tougher to keep alive. So what we might call glass cannon kind of units really fit into this C tier. You can still work with them, but it's just difficult to sustain long engagements, and you might think about going somewhere else in your tech tree unless you really, really need them. Now in the D tier units often have the unfortunate tendency of being counterproductive. They might fail to achieve their intended purposes. They really may only hit their stride very, very, very late in the game. There's not going to be a lot of D tier units because unique units are designed to, really help out your civilization. So this tier list is going to be a little more top heavy because, we're not sort of grading things on a curve and we're just kind of assessing the abilities of the units. But these units struggle a bit more, and we'll get into the particular reasons of why that is. And in the F tier units, these are meme units, essentially, and I'll just sort of spoil it from the jump that there's only one unit I think is so bad that it is in the F tier. So now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the tier list, getting the notes up, and we're going to start off with the Rambai. The Rambai is a unique unit from the Burmese, and it's going to go into the B tier. The Rambai has some nice qualities to it. It is essentially a cavalry archer class unit that does a pretty high amount of pierce damage, and that's good in that you can do some nice hit and run versus knights. It has some drawbacks, though. It can be a bit inaccurate, though. Something that is worth noting is that its missed shots do the entirety of their damage to surrounding units, whereas for most units, that gets reduced by half. So, against big masses of units, a Rambai can be pretty nice, and where the inaccuracy isn't hurting you quite as much. You can hit and run, but the thing is you have really low pierce armor, and so you've really got to micro them to keep them alive and keep that mass. So they can be kind of tricky to play with, and the fact that you can be so easily countered, say, by units like skirmishers or arbalists, for instance, who can really deal well with you from range, I think that puts them in the B tier. You can build your army around them, but it can get kind of difficult. All right, next up, we have the Ballista Elephant, and the Ballista Elephant I'm going to put into the C tier. I do think that this could be a borderline D tier unit, but the thing is that if you can get a lot of them, they can be really unstoppable. But they're very expensive. You do get countered by halberdiers. I believe that they can also be converted much like a regular unit. That I'm not sure about. Well, there's a lot of unique units. I'll say this as almost a pause. If I get something wrong with these unique units, because there's so many, leave a comment in the video. Let me know. There's a lot of balance changes to these units, especially unique units over the years. And so it can be tough to track all of that, and that can get pretty difficult. So, I'm not saying that I always get everything right, but I think that for all these units, I at least have the general thrust of it, so that way, we're still providing some decent value to help you in your gameplay. But yeah, Ballista Elephants, you just need a lot of them, and it can just be tough to get to that mass. So, but if you get there, right, and this is why they get into C tier, if you get there, they can be very powerful. All right, taking a moment to hydrate. Next up, we go to the Berserker. And the Berserker here is going to wind up in the A tier. One of the few infantry units that will wind up in the A tier. But look, ever since the most recent patch, infantry unique units have gotten some serious buffs, and the Berserker is one of the ones that is counted among those. In Castle Age, it has very strong damage. Same with Imp. It has pretty good HP and that can also regenerate, so that helps you a lot. The Viking unique tech Chieftains allows it to do extra bonus damage against cavalry, which means you can take pretty favorable matchups against heavy cavalry, and you're already defeating most infantry units that you can put out there in the field. And it even has decent mobility. I think that it can still be pretty easily countered by Arbalest, and in some cases, other unique infantry units. To really get it fully upgraded, it can be very expensive. Berserker Gang, the tech that increases the HP regeneration, is extremely expensive. I don't think I've ever played a game, and I've rarely seen a game where it even gets researched. What keeps the Vikings Berserkers out of S tier is it's just not a unit that you typically mass in early Castle Age. It's a unit you tend to see later on because the way Vikings often play out is by using their economy to get to Castle Age and make crossbows, and then late Castle Age into early Imp using your advantage that you've built up to go to Berserkers to close out the game. So, and then you probably mix in Skirmishers, and maybe you go something like Berserker, Siege Ram, Skirmisher, or something like that. So it's still a very effective unit, and you can use it in Castle Age now after the buffs. I think before the buffs, I'd probably make this a B tier unit just because it was the Castle Age version was just so weak, and it was even more expensive to get to. So, but it's an A tier unit for the time being. All right, next up on our list we have the Boyar, and the Boyar. I think the Boyar is probably the coolest looking unique unit in the game. I mean, you got a shield, a beard, and an axe. I mean, this is a this is a pretty gnarly dude right here, and it's incredibly strong. It has a lot of melee armor and attack. And in Castle Age, it can even do well against Castle Age camels, believe it or not. So it's a really strong melee fighter. What keeps it in B tier is it's still hard countered by the same kind of units that knights are, the spear line. So it's really not giving you a better option than Cavalier in those settings. You have to mass them from castles, and you're usually not playing into the Slavic bonus of their faster working farmers, because the faster working farmers is what really enables you to mass a bunch of knights in the mid game and win. And Boyars are pretty expensive. I believe they're 50 food, 80 gold, and you're using up a lot of gold and not a lot of food, so you're just not taking advantage of the Slav bonus. So, it's a B tier. You can use it as a knight replacement. That's just a bit more gold heavy, but getting to that mass in Castle Age can just be kind of difficult, and in some cases, you might just be better off going 3-4 stable knights. All right, next up we have the Camel Archer, and the Camel Archer is ready and raring to get into the S tier. One of the best units in the game. It has very high damage. It has an attack bonus against cavalry archers, so those really strong population efficient units, say like Mangadai, we'll talk about them in a minute, and just cavalry archers in general, they really have no chance against a camel archer because of its high damage and its low frame delay. It's very quick. It can pretty easily hit and run against knights as well. If you get the Imperial Age technology, your HP on the unit can regenerate at a pretty slow rate, but still, it's very effective. It's just a really effective unit, and it masses well in the Berber composition of, say, going camel archers and then fairly cheap hussars, at a 20% discount in Imperial Age, 15 in Castle Age. So it really is the backbone of your army, and I don't want to say it's matchup proof, but it can be very hard to field units that can counter it. The only downside of the Camel Archer is you don't get Parthian tactics, and so if halberdiers and siege rams are out there in the field, that is very much kind of a classic anti-Berber counter. And so you got to find some way to deal with that. But camel archers, really fantastic unit. Okay, next up we have the caravel, and we're gonna stay in the S tier for the caravel. These bad boys really wreck galleons and galleys because they're essentially a scorpion on the water, so they do a lot of pass-through damage. And if you're familiar at all with naval battles, ships tend to bunch up a lot, so you can get a lot of damage out of this unit. And Portuguese bonus gives them more HP. Castle Age bonus can give a bit more armor on your battleships. So, yeah, it's a really effective unit. And it might struggle a bit against fast fire ships in Imperial Age, but that's why you have things like demolition ships and they don't do friendly fire, so you can just kind of keep them hanging out. So, yeah, caravels are a very strong unit. All right, next up we have the cataphract, and the cataphract is going to go into the A tier. I think it's a borderline S tier unit, but I'll tell you what really keeps it out there for me. So the plus side is that you have anti-cavalry damage armor, which means that the spear line and the camel line does a lot less damage to you. You have anti-infantry bonus in your attacks, so that really helps you take out halberdiers or champion type units, any infantry. And there are a lot of unique infantry units, so that can be very effective against them. Not only that, but if you research Logistica in Imperial Age, you can get trample damage, and that actually helps you get some of that DPS to deal with heavy cavalry. And so if you get cataphracts in a scrum against, say, cavaliers, cataphracts actually do pretty decently. Where you really struggle are against units like heavy cavalry, paladins in particular, which you may not see as much in a 1v1. You might see it more in team game settings, though. But you have very low pierce armor, right? You have one base pierce armor, which means you can really struggle against arbalist. And so there's really two good counters there that, it's pretty likely that you can see going from game to game. And that means that you need to support the unit either with your cheap skirmishers or your cheap halberdiers. So your support units are there and they're easy to get to, but it can just be difficult to get to that big mass of cataphracts that you need and just have your army ready to go on open maps, especially. Maybe on more closed maps, right? I think that you can get to that a bit easier, but and in more closed maps, you're not raiding in the same way you are in more open maps. And having that one pierce armor really does kind of hurt your ability to raid. So, still a great unit. I say borderline S tier, but it has enough weaknesses to where I think we can drop it down to the A tier. All right, next up we have the Chukanu, a unique unit from the Chinese, and that is also going to go into the A tier. It is very high damage per second. It fires extra arrows, and that means that not only is it doing extra damage, but it can be very good against siege rams since those extra arrows do 0 melee damage, but siege rams have -3, I believe it is, melee armor. So those arrows are actually doing 3 damage, and that means that these Chukanu archers, they can take out rams pretty effectively, and that's something that is usually a counter against archer civilizations. So that's very strong, and not only that, but they're very cheap. I mean, they're 40 wood, 35 gold, so you can get a lot of damage and a lot of value out of them. What keeps them in the A tier is that they're very weak against onagers because they have one less range than, say, an arbalist unit. And as Chinese, you do lack bombard cannons, so you don't have a lot of really strong counters to deal with, say, halb and onagers. If you want to make Chukanu the backbone of your army, I mean, you can try to go light cavalry, but they'll die to the halbs. And then to stand and take out the halberdiers, you got to risk losing your Chukanu. So you probably have to go maybe like something like onagers of your own and try to trade them off maybe. It can get pretty difficult. And, the Chinese siege is usually oriented around trying to go scorpions, but scorpions get pretty easily countered by onagers. So it's a notable weakness. The unit is very strong, but in terms of the way games play out in your army, it can just get a bit difficult to if your opponent, knows what you're going for, and they can get to something like a Halb Siege composition, like Halb Onager in particular. All right, next up we have the Condottiero and Condottieri are going to go into the C tier. So, the Condottiero is an Italian team bonus unit, so I'm going to think a little bit about Italian teammates. And I'll do that for all the team bonus units, but I'll focus more on the Italians. The thing is it has decent HP, it's pretty mobile, it creates fast, it doesn't do a ton of attack, but really what it is the gunpowder version of a Huskarl. Talk about Huskarl in a minute, but basically it absorbs gunpowder damage and it dishes out bonus damage against gunpowder units. Now, the thing is that you get them as soon as you get to Imperial Age, so you can't mass them in Castle Age, so they're not going to help you there. And it plays out more as a raiding unit often in early Imperial Age because they don't have the highest DPS, and so you can create them very quickly. They are pretty expensive, and that's a major drawback. 50 food, I believe 35 gold. But you can get a good mass of them and raid your opponent like crazy and really cause a lot of problems. But the issue really there is that in early Imperial Age, right, there's usually not a lot of gunpowder on the field anyways. And few civilizations, I would say, are so reliant on gunpowder that they can't pursue other options. And so sometimes if you go Condottiero, you can find that you've invested a lot of gold into a unit that really isn't filling its role in life. Like the Condottiero is this kind of unit, that it always wanted to be an artist, but it's like working in an office somewhere. And, maybe it works fine. It works that 9-to-5 job, but it's just not fulfilling its purpose in life. And so, the way that it is usually played out oftentimes is on water maps of landing an opponent's island, putting down a lot of barracks, and especially having one of your teammates do this. So say Viking or Japanese that get really strong infantry bonuses. Malians can be pretty good there. And then do a quick raid and early up to try and end the game. But, outside of those settings, it just doesn't succeed nearly as much as it should. So C tier, you can use it, but beware, you're investing a lot of gold into a unit that really isn't living its dream. All right, next up, Conquistador. Conquistadors are going to go in the S tier. They're very strong. I will say I think I value them a little less than many other people, but I think you have to factor in, they just have so many good things going for them. They have very high damage, they're high HP, and this is from Castle Age onward, so you can really mass them well, you can hit and run against knights well, you can snipe villagers, Spanish builders get castles up pretty quickly, so you're going to be able to get the building up to mass them. Blacksmith upgrades don't cost any gold, so that helps you get their armor and preserve them. And so because it's a cavalry archer class unit, you can avoid taking fights to get a good mass up. Now, one of the problems is that they are easily countered by skirmishers, and that's usually something I'd use to put you into the A tier. They're also very expensive. They cost food and gold, so you can't go for something like, say, like Hussar and Conquistador. That would be a perfect way to deal with skirmishers, especially late, but they already cost food, and so that's too much food to really be able to go for in, I think, even early. Maybe if your economy is already maxed out, you could try something like that, and you already have a lot of Conquistadors alive. That's something you could do, but if you're trading the units and actually involved in some pretty aggressive fighting, and games these days can get pretty aggressive early on, it can be difficult. It can be tough to get to that good counter unit to deal with skirms, but it's so strong in Castle Age, and I will say it is so strong on closed maps that you really are forcing your opponent to tech into skirmishers, and so they're teching into a unit that can't really be used to damage you all that easily, and there's a lot of value in that. So Conquistadors can really help you control the pace of battles and set yourself up for a good late game. So I think it stays in the S tier, but in my mind, it does have its limitations, and you want to be aware of those. Okay, next up we have I believe it's the Costelier, and Costeliers, I'm going to put it into the B tier. Costeliers are a weird unit. They're a melee unit, but they are best optimized as a hit and run unit. So they're very strange. They're pretty cheap, so they don't cost a ton of food and gold. I forget exactly how much food, but I think it's like 55 gold. They're very effective versus melee civilizations because the way they function is their initial attack does a lot of melee damage, but their subsequent attacks for a short period of time do very little. So you have to sort of wait and recharge that big strike. So against melee units, they really can do well to take them out, but they're countered pretty well by ranged civilizations, especially cavalry archers that can apply hit and run strategies. And they're a bit fragile too. They don't have the most HP in the world, and so you have to babysit them because you have to hit and run them to use them most effectively. So I think as a B tier unit, you can make it a substitute for, say, going for the Nightline. That is something you can do with it, but it does need to be paid a lot more attention to. All right, next up we have the Elephant Archer, and I'm going to put the Elephant Archer in the C tier, but I'm only going to do so with some reservations. It has pretty high attack, and I mean it's a bloody tank, man. It's got well over 300 HP and fully upgraded. I think we're talking 9 pierce armor. Indians, which is the civilization that has this unit, do have Parthian tactics, so you do have that ability to snipe spearmen pretty well. The things about it is just it's extremely slow and it's very expensive, and like conquistadors, it costs food and gold, so it can be really difficult to pair this unit with something like hussars. Now, skirmishers are not necessarily the best counter just because it has so much HP, but it's just you would like to have a good raiding unit to go with it. But I will say I've seen games where it's worked, where you mass them together, just because if you can get that big mass, it's kind of like a ballista elephant. If you can get that big mass, you can really go in, do a lot of damage. And there are games I've seen, say, somebody pairing it with champions, and that can be pretty effective to deal with halberdiers as well, and just have a really just like slow glacial army strolling along the battlefield that can just be kind of difficult to stop. I think if there was one idea I'd have about elephant archers just off the top of my head is that I think it would actually be interesting if it cost 3 different resources. So like the same quantity, but say have it cost food, wood, and gold. That might make it more easily to get to army compositions, say like elephant archer, hussar, because maybe you could take the food cost down a little bit. But we're just speculating here, and that's just my wild take on things. But I think it can work in certain late game situations. So I think that's going to get into the C tier, but be advised it can be a bit awkward. All right, next up we have the Flaming Camel. Flaming Camel is no doubt in my mind an F tier unit. It's going to be the only F tier unit. You can only get it in Imperial Age after you research the unique technology Timurid Siegecraft. I have no idea why it only unlocks with an upgrade to your trebuchets, but whatever. It's like a petard against cavalry, especially effective against elephants, which you tend not to see all that much anyways, and it dies when you use it, so you need other units if you're going to actually raid or things like that. I just, and it's honestly, in practice, the times that I've seen it used, it still really hasn't even been that great at defeating, enemy cavalry. I mean, if you use it to take out light cavalry in the late game, well, who cares? Light cavalry just being spammed all over the place anyways. If you can get a good shot against a big ball of knights, okay, but, knights are mobile anyways. I think you run away to safety. So, I don't know. It's a pretty tough unit, and it's basically a meme as far as I'm concerned. All right, next up we have the Flemish Melissa. And not the Flemish Melissa. Hey, The so the Flemish militia, right, are basically you get them with the Imperial Age tech from Burgundians that change all of your villagers into this unit. And so, hey, maybe your female villagers, you might have a Melissa in there, and she could be a Flemish Melissa. But, for those not Flemish Melissa militia, we just have the normal Flemish militia. This is getting to be like an Abbott and Costello routine, but it's basically a cross between a champion and a halberdier, and it can be very effective versus cavalry, but it's countered pretty well by arbalist and then champions if you already have that unit on the field, or something like a champion. Let's say one of the unique unit of your of the unique unit infantry type units that you have here, like berserks, sergeants, etc. And a lot of civs actually have either arb or an infantry unit that can go against it. So it's the thing is I would normally say this is a C tier unit, but the way that you get it by having so many of them at once can be pretty devastating. I think a lot of times it tends to put a game on ice if you already have a lead. And then sometimes if you're up against somebody going really heavy into cavalry, it can bring a game back. But if somebody knows how to counter it well, and I think people are starting to develop that sense to defeat it, it can lose you some games, especially if you do it at the wrong time, actually. Like if you're not maxed out in villagers, or you don't have all your upgrades, or you don't have some siege to go with them, you can get them and really hurt yourself too, because now you have a bunch of villagers you got to replace. So yeah, I'm gonna put it in the B tier, but I mean, I'm actually just trying to think how many times I've been beaten by this strategy. I can only think of one time specifically. I'll keep it in the B tier though, because I've seen it work in other places. So, I for one, I actually don't like the technology. I don't have a problem with the unit, but I think the technology is kind of bogus, honestly. But that's a discussion for another day. Next up, we have the Gabedo. I put the Gabedo also in the B tier, and I'm much more comfortable with this unit there. It is a great hit and run. It is a bit of a glass cannon, and it's actually kind of expensive. It's 50 food and 40 gold, but they have a lot of mobility, and they do melee damage, but they do it from a pretty good range. I think they have a 6 range, and that's actually quite good, especially in Castle Age. I do think that when you get to Imperial Age, you need to transition maybe a bit out of the unit, but if you want to build your army around saying going Gabedos and hitting and running and slowing down your opponent in Castle Age to set up, say, like cavalry raids, or since Malians get plus 30% extra gold, maybe even going Cavalier, it could be a very strong unit with a really nice mobile army. And yeah, I've seen it work in a lot of different situations, and so I think that's well enough to be a B tier unit. All right, next up we have the Genitor, and Genitor are also going to go into the C tier. They're stronger than a typical elite skirmisher. They do more damage and HP. I think they have more bonus damage as well. They're a team bonus unit, so certain civilizations have very good ones. Turks, who have notably awful skirmishers, have great Genitors. But the thing about the team bonus unit for Genitors, whereas if you think of say the Condottiero, where it can get some play in islands and those kind of map settings, in team games it seems pretty rare that you actually see them. So I think you have to think about it more as a Berber unit, and the game usually just doesn't unfold to make them all that worthwhile. Elite skirmishers are much cheaper than Genitors. They basically cost half the Genitors cost double the food of an elite skirmisher, so it's 50 food, 35 wood. Elite skirmishers do a fine job countering arbalist, and if you're up against cavalry archers and you want the mobility, camel archers already have a bonus against them, and they can hit and run other melee units. So I would rather have camel archers if I'm up against cavalry archers. So I just don't think in practice it fills a role that that it needs to. Like, whereas I described the Condottiero as an artist working a job that it doesn't want to oftentimes, I think the Genitor is a unit that, you know, it the jobs that it's meant to do, there's just somebody else that already has the job that can either do it better or cheaper than them. So it just really has a tough time making it into the Berber army. All right, next up we have the Genoese crossbowmen. And I'll put Genoese crossbowmen into the B tier here. This unit's notable for having an attack bonus against cavalry, which is really good for Italians because you miss halberdiers, and you don't have camels either. So if you really want an anti-cavalry specialist, Genoese crossbow are quite good for that. They're pretty tanky, and the Castle Age bonus that you can research for Italians, Pavisa, gives you +1 melee and pierce armor. And not only that, but very recently, over the last 6 or 7 months or so, they've gotten buffs to their firing rate and creation time. So the unit is more viable than it used to be. I think maybe a year ago, I'd say this is a C tier unit because it would just be a lot harder to get to. The cost is pretty reasonable, 45 wood, 40 gold. It's a pretty interesting comparison, actually, with the Chukonu. I put this unit in the B tier because, the Chukonu, as a comparative example, has a lot higher DPS, it is cheaper, and it deals with Siege Ram, a notorious archer counter, in a way that Genoese crossbowmen don't. Genoese crossbowmen do lack a range, so I think they're a 4-range unit, which makes them a bit weak to onagers, but they can take an onager shot, and Italians do get cheap bombard cannons, so I think you could argue that they, as a civilization, Italians deal with onagers a bit better, say, than Chinese, but I think you're just getting more out of the Chukonu than, say, something like a Genoese crossbowman. But still a pretty good unit, and definitely one that probably should see a more play now than it did in the past. Okay, next up we have the Hufnisa, and that's going to go in the A tier. This is a Bohemian unique unit that is an upgrade to the Bombard Cannon. It's basically a cross between Bombard Cannons and Onagers, which sounds fantastic. It one-hit KOs Siege Onagers, which is really useful because, just one Siege Onager shot can feel like it can destroy a huge portion of your army. So being able to take them out in one hit and not having a Siege Onager on, say, 5 HP or something still prowling the battlefield can be really useful. Now, the issues with it is that, and what really keeps it out of S tier, is that it's really expensive to get to. I mean, the Bombard Cannon is already a very expensive unit, and this upgrade is 950 food, 750 gold, which is pretty nuts. You can't research the upgrade to the Bombard Cannon until you already have chemistry, which is required for Bombard Cannon, so you're really only getting to the Hufnisa. On an open map, you really might never get there, and you have to... It's going to be sometime later on in Imperial Age, even though Bohemians can research chemistry in Castle Age, so, but you still have to wait for that. Like, you have to be going for that strategy, which is pretty common for Bohemians, so, but you still have to, even if you already have chemistry in Castle Age, you still got to get the upgrade, and it's massively expensive. I do think it's an S tier unit on Arena or other closed maps. On open maps, where, Hussars and cavalry have a way of sniping your siege and then running away, I would say it's more of a B tier unit, maybe even a C tier unit, just because it's so hard to get to. But I think overall, for what it can do, if you can get it, keep it alive, and Bohemians have halberdiers that do, and all their spearline units for that matter, do 25% more bonus damage. I think you can make a case for A tier and on Arena S tier, but A tier overall. All right, next up the Huskarl, and Huskarl, this is an easy S tier unit. It is an infantry unit that does anti-archer attack and has very high pierce armor, so it's also pretty quick, so it can close the distance against archers, not take that much damage, and dispatch them very quickly. Goth infantry have a discount. You can make this unit at barracks after the Anarchy technology, and Goth barracks work fast. In fact, they work extremely fast once you research perfusion. The Huskarl is great, and it is almost always the focal point of the Gothic army. The only issue with it is that it's not a great melee fighter, and this can really get you into trouble. civilizations with champions, you have to find some other way of going for them. And with Goths, you don't have the best ranged options, but you do have some interesting ways you can play it with, say, going heavy Scorpion. You do have hand cannoneers you can go to. But I mean, you have to think about this strategically. If somebody's going Huskarls, they basically, you shut down their archers and you're really forcing them. If they don't have knights or something like that, you're forcing them to go down the swordsman line. And I mean, that's a win right there. I mean, you're really dictating the way that the game is going to be played. And, with Goths, hey, switch into your own champions if you need to. So, Huskarl, easy S tier. It's definitely not holding the civilization back. And it's one of the things that, makes Goths a really difficult situation to play against for a lot of people. All right, next up we have the Hussite Wagon, another unique unit from the Bohemians. And I got to give this thing an S tier. It's extremely tanky. And really the counters to it are onagers, maybe opponents' knights as well can do pretty well, but Bohemians have very good pikes that can do extra damage to it, and not only that, but it protects units behind it. So if you go that Bohemian Kimbo strategy, right, where you have the crossbows with chemistry and Castle Age, that you can keep them from taking a lot of damage, you can protect a lot of units. You can go and hide units behind them, and even if they're hit, say, by archers, you're not going to have the same damage done. Very, very useful unit here. Bohemians get a stone mining bonus. All the stone mining upgrades are free, so you can get the castles pretty quickly. And honestly, you would think the unit would be more expensive, but it's 110 wood, which is a lot. That's hard to stomach, but only 70 gold. And so with the gold mining bonuses you get, I mean, you get to Castle Age. You already have both your gold mining bonuses. You can actually get this unit out in the field. There's no minimum range on the unit. I mean, it's pretty strong, I gotta say. I mean, the real disadvantage is that it doesn't fire all that quickly. And it does have its counters, but you have to make its counters are very, very expensive. Particularly mangonels, and if you protect it with halberdiers, it's really, or pikemen rather, it's really hard to go knights to counter it. Knights do well against it, but it can get really tricky. So yeah, it's a very strong unit. I say easily it's an S tier unit, and has decent mobility too. So for not that much of a price tag, so really good unit. Okay, next up we have the Imperial Camel, and I actually rank the Imperial Camel a bit lower than most people, and I'll tell you why. And this is more of a recent thing. The good things about it is that it's a fairly tanky unit with 160 HP, and compared to the Heavy Camel, it has +2 attack, so it's pretty decent as a melee fighter, even against some infantry units for that matter. And the Indian civilization has a bonus where their camels do extra attack against buildings, which is to make up for the fact that the civilization doesn't have knights. Now, that's all well and good, but you only have 4 pierce armor. This is a pretty new change over the last year. You used to have 5 pierce armor. Having 4 pierce armor really, really hurts. It makes it a bit more difficult to raid and be able to stick around and use that anti-building bonus, and you still die pretty easily to ranged units, and you don't have knights to go against it. It can just be really difficult. You still are pretty hard countered by halberdiers. It's a very expensive upgrade, 1,200 food, 600 gold. It's a unit that you only get in Imperial Age, so it's not helping you in Castle Age. And if you really want to mass camels up in Castle Age, well, now you have to mass up a unit that, again, is not the strongest raiding unit, can still be pretty countered by archers. So, you actually don't see it that much in Indian gameplay these days. I actually think of all the civilizations, Indians really need some kind of redesign. It feels like almost everybody go for cavalry archers with them, or maybe even Indian light cav in Castle Age. You do see camels from time to time, more in team games, right? I think it's fine for team games, but for 1v1 settings, it feels it's a really tricky unit. And the fact that it's still so easily countered by halberdiers, and there's a lot of other camel units that can fare pretty decently with it. I don't know. I think it could use the extra 5 pierce armor personally that it used to have, but that's just me. But I think that because of all that, it's a B tier unit now. All right, next up we have the Imperial Skirmisher, and Imperial Skirmisher, I gotta put it in the A tier. It's quite good. You know, it's giving you basically more attack, more damage, more pierce armor. It's a team bonus unit. Sometimes you'll see it in 2v2 settings. I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's still just a skirmisher, but against archer-dependent civilizations like Britons, Ethiopians, and Mayans, that are often some of the most picked, it can win you matchups by going for them. A very difficult unit to stop. All right, next up we have the Jaguar Warriors, as I hydrate a little bit. And we're barely even halfway through this. But there's a lot of unique units. What can I say? I didn't design the game. And I want to give each of them their due. So, stick with me here, folks. I got to say, I think the Jaguar Warriors now, again, after a lot of the buffs that we've seen to unique unit infantry, I think they're a B tier unit now, maybe a C tier unit in prior days. Unit's claim to fame is that it's an infantry unit that does anti-infantry attack. And after you research Garland Wars and Imperial Age, it has 20 base attack already. That's quite good. Well, I say 20 base attack, 12, 4 from the Blacksmith, and then 4 from Garland Wars, so you get to 20. And then you have the bonus damage on top of it, so it really can wreck infantry. Its training time has been reduced. Its HP has been boosted. And so that was something that really held the unit back. And so now, it's a pretty tanky unit as well. Aztecs have a production bonus to all their military buildings. I believe that applies to their castle. That's actually something, now that I'm saying it. I'm not certain about it. If somebody knows, go ahead and drop a head in the comments. But it still trains pretty quickly anyways. So either way, you can get them out in the field. And you know what? It pairs really nicely with Eagles if your opponent is making swordsmen to deal with them. And in my experience, you often, in that situation, really don't even need the elite upgrade for it. And if you do make them the backbone of a really slow army, you do have atlatl skirms to support them against archer units. And so, yeah, I think Jaguar Warriors, they do need some support, but if you want to go with a slow-moving army composition, I think you can do it with the civilization. I think that they're a little undervalued right now, and that it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me if we see more of them in the future. Okay, next up, the Janissary. I'm going to put Janissaries in the C tier. Again, I think I might value this unit less than others, but the plus side, it has high damage. It does have good range in theory in Castle Age, but the range is kind of a Potemkin advantage because the unit has a low rate of fire, high frame delay, and is pretty inaccurate. I think that the Castle Age unit is only 50% accurate. The Elite unit is only 65%, which is still not that great. So you typically don't want to be fighting from that range anyways. It's very expensive. 60 food, 55 gold, very little mobility. I think that the Janissary has a very situational role. It can really be an important unit on maps like Arena, where players go for highly planned strategies to do fast Imperial Age aggression with Turks. And the thing about that is that is more exploiting a civilization bonus to get up faster, as opposed to being a credit to the unit itself. So, I don't know. It's a tricky unit. The elite upgrade also costs a lot of gold. Something to keep in mind, though, is that the elite unit upgrade actually reduces the frame delay from 12 to 0. And that can be pretty important, actually, because 12 frame delay, that's a little, frame delay can, keep, it's basically when your unit targets a unit and takes that first shot, how fast it does it. So, we see units like cavalry archers for a while. The fact that they've had a higher frame delay means that typically they've not been the best hit and run units, whereas you compare, say, to a Kipchak or a Mangdai or a camel archer, which we've already talked about. They can hit and run pretty well because of their low frame delay. So it's it's good, not great in that, but it's a situational unit and can be a part of some pre-planned strategies for Turks. Okay, next up we have the Kamayuk. And Kamayuk, I gotta say, this is a unit that I think I value a bit more than others. I'm going to put it in the A tier. It has pretty high HP, right? 70 in Castle Age, 80 in Imperial Age. And after the unique tech, I think it's Fabric Shields in Imperial Age, you can get 6 Pierce Armor on them. That is quite good and helps keep them alive. It has 1 range, so when it's fighting against other melee units, units in the back can go ahead and attack over the ones in front. That means you can get a lot more damage out of them. It has an anti-cavalry bonus, which means that it's very, very effective against cavalry units. But the fact that it has the range also means that it deals pretty well with regular infantry. And look, the fact that you can get 6 Pierce Armor on it in Imperial Age, that means it's not too shabby even against archer units. Still doesn't have quite the HP. Archers is still a good counter, but and especially if you catch them without the armor, right? That's really what you want to do, not let them get terribly late with it. But it's a good unit, and it's a very quick training time. I think about 10 seconds. So the story with Kamayuk's kind of the story of all of the American civilizations. You're pretty gold dependent. You can pair skirmishers with them, and that's fine. But it's probably better to go with your own eagles that will also have that extra pierce armor because the same upgrade affects them. So, it's a very good unit though for what it can do, and I think it can give a lot of value. All right, next up on our list we have the Karambit Warrior, and this is going to be one of my D tier units, folks. I know some people really like them, but let me say say the good things about them first. They're fairly cheap, right? They're 25 food, 15 gold. I think it's the food cost that's what's really good there because most of your unique unit infantry are, say, 55 to 60 food. But the thing about them that's unique is they only take up half a population space. So in theory, you can mass, a lot of them and still be under your population limit. And they create pretty quickly too. But they're just kind of squishy. And by kind of squishy, I mean very squishy. You're tied for the lowest hit points in the game with skirmishers and archers. You're really trying to leverage the fact that you only take up half the population, but that means you're really only hitting your stride much later in the game. And that is when population efficiency really starts to take over, and it's not a very population efficient unit. It dies to a lot of different units, heavy cavalry and arbalist. I mean, it really just depends on the mass, honestly. It's not a great raiding unit because it has so little HP, so you often need something else to raid. And it's not a very good substitute even for the swordsman line because it doesn't do that much bonus damage against eagles, and it's already doing low melee damage, so you can run into trouble there. Everything with the Karambit Warrior hinges on getting to that super, super favorable numbers advantage, and that means that, in a game that's very, very passive, you can get there, but in a game that's not passive, it can be really, really tricky to get there with them. You just have to play melee in either a really passive or really ultra defensive manner, and even then, can you get that mass and really raid with them if your opponent has a lot of range units, a lot of castles, etc. It can be pretty tough. It has its purposes, but often trying to go for them if the game suddenly gets aggressive means that things can kind of snowball out of your favor if you start losing that mass of them. All right, next up we have the Keshik. And the Keshik, for me, I gotta say, is Keshik's a borderline S tier unit. Let me think about this. I gotta put it in the A tier, but I think it's a great unit, and I think people. It's funny. I hear people say that people are sleeping on the Keshik, and people are saying that every time, and so people are sleeping on the unit. But the fact that a lot of people keep telling people they're sleeping on the unit doesn't wake anybody up, it seems. But look, you're okay melee fighter. I think that's 11 damage for the elite version, 9 for the regular. It's very cheap. Very cheap, 60 food, 40 gold. And honestly, it's a less than 40 gold unit because its claim to fame is that as it attacks units, it creates gold for your civilization that it just deposits immediately. So that's fantastic. Very cheap. It's very tanky. You got 160 HP and 7 pierce armor for the elite. That's massive. So it's a great rating unit. It creates very quickly. And even though it's not the best at melee fighting, and it only has 1 melee armor on its base version, the extra 20 HP kind of helps make up for it. What keeps it out of the S tier is that, still dies to halberdiers pretty well. You'll get a little bit of your gold back, though. So that's why I think borderline S tier here. Top of A tier. It's probably not your optimal army composition for Tatars. That's usually going to be something like heavy cavalry archer and hussars. But going Keshik and maybe even mixing in something like heavy camels or also adding your fully upgraded skirmishers, it can be a very cost-effective combo. I know in team games, one of my favorite things to do is play Keshik Heavy Camel. Personally, it can be a lot of fun. And the fact that it trains so quickly really helps you get them out in the field. A-tier unit, it can be the focal point of your army. But you don't often see Tatter players do it that way, but it definitely can be done. All right, next up, we have the Kipchak. Kipchak, A-tier unit, does some pretty nice damage. It's basically a Chukunu on a horse. It's pretty cheap, 60 wood, 35 gold. I mean, it's the same gold price as a Chukunu. It's just a little bit more wood, and its elite upgrade doesn't cost gold, right? It's low frame delay, so it's a very good hit and run unit. Can kill rams. Really, the only issue is that in Castle Age, it's really fragile, and so you can lose your mass of them. You do get a lot more armor in Imperial Age because you get Parthian tactics, all the armor upgrades, but you don't get Bracer. All right, so you got to get in closer to fight. So I think at the lack of DPS is what keeps it at S tier for me. Yeah, I know. You just got to get too close to the battle with it, but borderline S tier. All right, next up we have the Conic. Conic's going to go right into the B tier. Conic's one of those units that in theory kind of sounds overpowered, right? It's a unit that lives 2 lives. The cavalry version dies and then gets recreated as an infantry unit. You can mass them at Krapost, which are a unique building of the Bulgarians, which is pretty nice. But I mean, you just need so much to really get you there. You need the Stirrups technology in Castle Age to increase the attack rate. You need to get not only cavalry upgrades, but infantry upgrades. Now, Bulgarians do have cheaper blacksmith upgrades to help get you there. The Pierce Armor, I think, is only 1 in Castle Age, and it's the elite version that has 2 base Pierce Armor, so it's still not a great rating unit in Castle Age. And so where it's really going to shine is in Imperial Age. It's a good unit. It can function as a knight surrogate, and the elite version does have more HP than a cavalier. But it does take a while to get there, and you can kind of replace the unit with, say, like, go, I don't know, Hussars, 2-handed swordsmen, or even go with Cavaliers yourself. It's not a terrible downgrade. I think if I were going to give the unit a bit of a push, if the infantry benefited from the Bagains technology, which gives the infantry more melee armor, I think we'd see Conics a lot more often. But, if any of the developers are watching this video, there's a suggestion, that and the Elephant Archer, if everybody out there is listening. Okay, and if everybody has any thoughts on that, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd like to see what other people think about it as well. All right, next up we have the Lytus. And Lytus is going to stay in the B tier. You get a lot of damage out of it, particularly if you can collect some relics. Ignoring melee armor is its claim to fame, so it's really great against some of the better melee units. It takes on paladins very well. Quite cheap, 70 food, 50 gold, right? So the issue here is that it dies pretty fast to Arbalest because it only has 1 pierce armor, so you can compare that with the Cataphract, but it doesn't have all those funky bonuses that the Cataphract does to help its survivability. You can also compare it a bit with the Conic. Whereas I think a unit like the Conic, you can actually use it to replace your Nightline. Lidus are a bit too squishy to pierce damage. The cost effectiveness is great though, and you can play it a bit differently in that way. Maybe pair it with your really awesome Lithuanian skirmishers. And hey, if you want to see a good video on skirmishers, check out one of my videos in the tier list from earlier. But yeah, I just don't think it replaces the Nightline because it just doesn't have the raiding ability that Knights do. So still a good unit, but not all the way there. All right. Next up, the Longbow. Easy S tier. Do a good bit of damage. Fire multiple arrows. It's like a Chukunu of the sea. Has good mobility. It actually trains. This is one of the best qualities of it. It trains much faster than Galleons. I want to say it is 25 seconds for longboats, 36 for Galleons. So it's a very, very quickly trained unit. And from the same building as Galleons. So, it's, if you have a bunch of docks, then, it's not like say looking at like castles versus stables where you're going to have more stables than castles. No, like it's trained from the same building. It's a bit more expensive, but you still are getting a discount because you're Vikings, but very population efficient unit, very high quality. All right, next up we are going to go the Longbowman, a fan favorite. And the Longbowman's going to wind up in the A tier. Insane range. The elite version does get a base pierce armor. It's fairly cheap too. I think it's only 40 gold. But here's the thing, and why I think it stays at the S tier is that it just really doesn't differentiate itself very much from Arbalest. You get a little more range, a little more pierce armor, a little more cost savings on the gold. But you actually do have to give something up. You're giving up the fact that the Arbalest upgrade is pretty cheap, and Arbalest already have very good range, and British archery ranges work faster. And you're making these units from castles, so that faster range bonus is very good. You're probably already making crossbows and Castle Age anyways, and so you should have stables. It can be an overwhelming unit. It's more suited, I think, to closed maps. Open maps, I don't think you're getting that much of an advantage over the Arbalest in practice. Yes, in theory, in terms of performance, if you were able to get to as many longbowmen, sure. But Arbalest and archers in general really need a lot of mass to be able to deal with their opposing units. And I think in a lot of roles, I do like just sticking with the Arbalest line. So that's going to keep the unit in the A tier, but still very good. All right, next up, Magyar Hussar, and one of the coolest units in the game. Magyar unique unit, becomes a trash unit, very strong Hussar, markedly better stats than the Hussar when you get to the elite version. Actually, even the non-elite version is still, I think, stronger than a Hussar, so you have a very good unit. Anti-siege bonus allows you to get a lot of value from them. Diving under castles, sniping trebuchets. The real knocks against it, it doesn't do the anti-monk damage that Hussars do, which is fine. It's not the biggest deal. That's not what puts it in A tier. What puts it in A tier, at the end of the day, it's still countered by halberdiers. And so it's not like a matchup-proof, really difficult game-changing matchup. It's just optimizing your army to... It's just optimizing the trash component of your army, but you still need that good gold unit, and you can do it with heavy cav archers from the Magyars too. It can really help win you some games, but at the end of the day, it is, it's still an A tier unit because you can counter it in the same way that you would a Hussar. All right, next up we have the Mameluke. And the Mameluke is going to go into the C tier as well. I think it's a borderline D tier unit. It's very good against cavalry units, but it's very expensive. I think it's 80, 85 gold. I forget. It's 80 plus gold at minimum. It's a camel, so it's pretty squishy. It gets pretty much any other kind of unit. that it runs up against, and you have to hit and run, babysit it a lot. You know, it has its role, but honestly, rather than having to make the super expensive unit from a castle, I would much rather make really good Saracen camels that have a lot more HP, and that would be my preference. So I just don't think it fits really well into the army composition that you would want to go for with Saracens typically. But that might just be me. So I'll see C tier just because it does so well against cavalry if it finds itself in that setting. All right, next up, Mangudai. Mangudai, I think most people consider it the best unit in the game. And, God, it's very hard for me to disagree with that. It has extremely high damage, in part not only the fact that doing the elite version doing 8 pierce damage, but it's really the fact that Mongol cav archers fire, I think it's 33% faster, some number like that. So you're doing that damage to an opponent a lot. And so it's very strong. You do have Parthian tactics to help you kill spears. Mangudai do siege bonus damage. So if you've ever been in a position fighting against Mangudai and you have siege, they just tend to, waltz around your siege weapons, killing them and split microing, and then they just run away. The Mangudai is the ultimate hit and run machine. It does have a bad matchup against camel archers if they're on the field, but basically in any other setting, it really is going to be the backbone of your army. Even skirmishers can have some trouble holding out against it because it just does so much damage. All right, next up we have the missionary. Man, I'm trying to decide between D tier and F tier. I think I got to say D tier. Having the mobility is nice. I do think it's nice to have mobility to, say, run away from maybe knights or can't. Well, you shouldn't be running away from knights in general, but one of the problems with the missionaries is that you convert from so much closer, right? Monks convert from 9 range, and I think missionaries convert from 7. So you might actually have a knight close down to you and be able to take you out. But being able to maybe try and run away from scouts, but even still, you're still not that fast. I don't know. The real problem with missionaries in practice is you can't pick up relics, and one of the most important things that monks are doing for you for your civilization success is, other than countering enemy knights, is picking up relics. Having a little bit of extra mobility. There are some meme strategies where people can go for missionary rushes and try and convert lots of knights and things like that. I think there's room for it to work, but not a lot of room for it. D tier, I've been in some team games where people have gone for it, and it's actually been kind of surprising. If it takes you by surprise, you're not expecting it, that can make life kind of awkward, but otherwise, I can't put it in F tier because it's not a meme. It is kind of a meme, but it's not a total meme unit, so I'll keep it in the D tier, but I would not usually advise of going against it. Monks usually are better. Okay, now the Obu. The Obu, I'm going to put in S tier. What to say? It's a very cheap 55 food, 20 gold, very high HP, 80 HP in Castle Age, 95 in Imperial Age. It has 2 melee and 2 pierce armor. Even the regular version has 2 melee and 2 pierce armor. That's fantastic. Its claim to fame is that it scrapes the armor off of opposing units, so that's massive. Think about it this way. Every time it scrapes armor off an opposing unit, it's like it's not only giving itself bonus damage, but also giving bonus damage to every unit in your army. That's massive, right? Imagine you take a group of these bad boys and say you run up against some knights, and let's say you even lose the battle. By the time it's done, though, you've scraped off so much pierce armor from those knights that they're going to have a really difficult time, say, raiding town centers. Right? And so they may have to go back and get healed up because the only way you can get the armor back is by healing up to full HP. That's massive. And they're pretty effective at killing buildings, too. They have a pretty nice bonus there. The Polish stone mining bonus means you can get to castles more quickly, get them out in the field. They train pretty quickly, even though that was increased recently as well. The only knock on it is that it just doesn't do quite the damage, and It doesn't get a huge bonus damage versus eagles. But hey, once you scrape off the pierce armor of eagles, maybe you can still even go arbalist against them. So still very, very good unit. And I got to put in the S tier. You know, I think you can integrate it into any army. All right, next up, we have, as this video is getting quite long, we have the organ gun. I put the organ gun in the B tier. It's strong. It's not terribly expensive for a siege weapon. It can just get overwhelmed. As a minimum range, it's slow, and it does pierce damage, and that can be a problem because it's not as good against buildings, I think. It's much better in a closed map arena type option than on an open map, in my experience, and that's enough for a B tier. Plumed archers, extremely strong. I mean, you have a lot of mobility. They move fast. They have good damage, high pierce armor. They have a little bit less range, but you know, with all the movement that you get out of them, very good unit, and you could make it the backbone of your army for sure. All right, rattan archers, I'm gonna put in the A tier. You know, the thing about rattan archers, you get very high pierce armor, so even skirmishers have trouble dealing with you, and enemy archers are also, they're kind of an anti-archer archer. I think Spirit of the Law had said that, and it's a really nice description. Skirmishers still are cost effective because, you know, they are doing a decent bit of bonus damage, and it's pretty pricey for a unique unit foot archer. It's 50 wood, 45 gold. What really knocks us down is the range from the regular unit, and that means that it's only 4 on the regular, 5 based on the elite. That means mangonels can still really be a problem early. And the thing that differentiates it, say, from plumed archers to me is that because you don't have the mobility on the rattan archer like you do the plumes, it can just be a little bit harder to get the mass up if somebody is going mangonels or onagers. So I think it also reminds me a bit of the longbowman in that you just want to ask yourself how much value are you getting out of the unit. If you're up against strong archer civilizations, you are probably getting that value. But if you're up against cavalry civilizations, I don't know. You might want to think about what your army composition is going to be. You still might go for it, but you might not. You know, is it worth investing all that economy into castles, or just, investing in something else and trying to get your support units out? That's the way I would think about it. All right, in the B tier, we're going to see the samurai. You know, it has an attack bonus against unique units. Its attack speed is very fast. It creates very quickly. Still dies to archers, but it can replace your swordsman line as just kind of a higher quality, more population efficient version. But it will die to, most of the same counters. All right, next up is the sergeant, and I got to put the sergeant into the A tier. Very strong unit, very tanky. It has a lot of hit points and armor. It gets up to 8 pierce armor in Imperial Age, which is massive. It can build Sicilian donjons, which are basically towers that also can be used to create the unit. It's also available in Feudal Age. Probably not worth it. It's pretty expensive. I think it's like 50 food, 35. No, I think it's 60 food, 35 gold, actually. So very pricey. You can die to archers if you get caught without all your upgrades. It's kind of like Flemish militia, but I do think that while the power spike of Flemish militia is probably stronger than Sicilian's First Crusade, where you can get up to 35 of them, I think as a unit, the sergeant is much stronger, sort of in a head-to-head way, and you can keep creating them, keep getting them massed, and it just fits into the Sicilian army a bit better. So I think it's worth sticking it in the A tier. All right, next up we have Ethiopians with the Shotel Warrior. I'm going to put Shotels in C tier. Shotels are an expensive glass cannon, and they do create quickly. They used to be a bit more expensive than they were. Now I think they're 50 food, 30 gold. But, if Ethiopians had champions, I doubt we'd see them very much, and it all just depends on how fast you can close the gap with this unit, because if you're up against a lot of archers and this unit gets taken out, then you're not going to get a lot of damage in the field. Or if it's in melee combat and it's going up against very strong melee units and then dies before it can get a lot of attack out, you're still not performing the role very well. So It's fine. I think it's a really nice. It's a decent raiding unit, especially when you're raiding units that aren't protected, say, by town centers or castles. So you can use it, and it has a place, and it's still pretty good against eagles too, actually. But still not the best unit. There's probably more effective units you can go for. Okay, slingers. This is an anti-infantry bonus. It's kind of like a hand cannoneer for Incas, but you do get it in Castle Age, and it does benefit from archer bonuses. So, it's a pretty good unit. Very situational if the opponent is going for a lot of infantry. It's not terribly expensive. I think 40 food, 30 gold. I might have that backwards. Um, it has a minimum range that needs to be reduced. It can be taken on by enemy archers and skirmishers. It's one of those questions that you want to ask yourself, are you really doing better than an arbalist here? Arbalists are usually more generalized in terms of their ability, whereas slingers are really most effective against enemy infantry. And a lot of the bonus damage in these situations kind of winds up just being overkill and not actually even used all the way. So there's a lot of questions as to whether it really is more effective in practice than Arbalist. Okay, next up, Tarkans. Our Tarkans are in the A tier. Very, very strong unit. Gotta say, high hit points, high pierce armor. It's not that difficult to get to. You can make it at stables after you research Marauders. Really, the only issue that's keeping it in A tier is you do have low melee armor. So it's not the best melee fighter, though it can hold its own against Cavaliers, but will die to Paladins, will die to Camels, will die to Halberdiers. It's kind of a power spike unit in 1v1s where you can get a lot of them massed up, destroy a bunch of buildings, and just snowball from there. So it's a solid unit for what you pay for, and if you're up against archers, it can be very deadly. Okay, next up, the Teutonic Knight. Got to go in the B tier. It's a very strong unit. A lot of HP, a lot of attack, great melee armor, and after crenellations, you can garrison them in castles to fire arrows like you can with all your infantry in that situation. It's really slow and it's really expensive. And again, you're asking this question: is it really better to use this unit to replace your champion that already has +2 melee armor? I mean, it depends. It's going to be a more population efficient version of that, but is it worth what you're paying for it? Is it worth the lack of mobility? I mean, if you're making it, you're probably going to be up against melee units anyways, so I think it's fine in most cases, but you do want to consider it. And it's also one of the coolest looking units in the game, which of course is highly, highly valued. All right, next up, we get to the Throwing Axemen, and I'm going to put the Throwing Axemen into the C tier. I think the way it plays out more often is as a complement to Paladins in the late game situation, or as a trash killer alternative. It does melee damage from range and has good HP, isn't that expensive, and Franks can get castles out in the field pretty quickly. It just doesn't have a lot of damage, and it dies to too many things. If heavy cavalry or mass infantry get close, it can die to Arbalist. It can even die to Onagers because it doesn't have that much range. I think it's 5 range if you research Bearded Axe. So you have to research technology to get to 5 range, and it doesn't benefit from archer upgrades. So, you can't really hit and run with it to preserve it. Yeah, I think it performs a role, just not usually a main role. So that's what you would want to consider with it. Turtle ships. Kind of a tough unit to judge. We don't see it all that much. I might be completely off base here, but to me, I think it's a C tier unit. Look, I think it's designed to be kind of a one-man wrecking crew, or a one-ship wrecking crew. But it's insanely expensive. And it doesn't have that much range. Its rate of fire is like half of that of a galleon. It's this question, given what you're paying for it, right? You're counting on really one unit being able to go up against multiple units. And if there's lots of fire ships and things like that on the field, which tend to predominate the battle in feudal age, maybe even, if you're going turtle ships, it's just so expensive. I just don't think it's worth the cost. But I could be completely wrong about that. I see them very rarely, And, they can do a lot of damage, but, they can also get kind of ganged up on. So, War Elephant. Man. What to say about the War Elephant? I personally find War Elephants as a D tier unit. The real problem is that they're just slow, and yeah, they're super strong and tanky, but they're insanely expensive. And honestly, they still die too easily to halberdiers, and if they're converted by monks now, they're calling the ambulance for you. So, it just doesn't usually work into the compositions that you want to go to, I think. And all of a sudden, if a few of them start getting converted, that can be very bad. It can snowball against you really quickly. Right. We're getting there. Ooh, let's put this in order. War Wagons, easy S tier. A lot of damage, very tanky. Cavalry Archer class unit, but you have so much HP, and Koreans get their armor upgrades for free. It can be a very, very difficult unit to stop. Some combination maybe of monks, heavy cavalry. Skirmishers actually aren't all that effective just because they have so much HP. They can work, but they're typically not the best counter. And Koreans have a stone mining bonus to get to castles quickly. War Wagons, if they get to a big number, can just be very, very hard to deal with. All right, next up, Winged Hussar. Winged Hussars are an A tier unit, and I like Winged Hussars a lot. You're basically getting an extra melee armor, a bit more HP. They're unique to the Poles and the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians are missing Blast Furnace, so the attack is the same as a Hussar, but it is better in pretty much every other respect. It has the same Pierce armor. The Poles, on the other hand, you're missing the last armor, but you can get trample damage with them, and so it can be a very effective melee unit. I think it's A tier. Probably your main trash unit that you're going for if you are the Poles, and if the Lithuanians, if you're not going to heavy cavalry, it's probably going to be this unit. But Poles have great trash units in general. So next up, Woad Raiders. Last, definitely not least, Woad Raiders are a really fast infantry unit, and now with the recent buff, they are in that situation where they can get out there and do a lot of damage. I think that they're a really nice unit. They have pretty good attack, and they can play a role in the Celtic army of getting out there in the field and raiding and really making it difficult for your opponent to concentrate and work against you. They can die to some of the other unique infantry units, but they do have a really important role to play in the army, and I think it's a great unit overall. You just got to get to it, and you're probably making infantry already with Celts, so you should have the upgrades. Mixing these into your army to raid opponents and really snowball those siege pushes can be quite strong. So, and that's it. That's the tier list. I think this is the longest tier list that I have ever done on the channel. So I'm not going to prattle too long after the video. I was going to say, if you've made it to the end, go ahead. I appreciate it. If you have any agreements, disagreements, leave it in the comment section below. If there's something I missed, let me know. And yeah, throw us that like, subscribe, and I'll see you all out there on the ladder. Peace.